We're now moving into East Asia, and I'm going to be giving an overview of some key concepts around health and healing in the Chinese tradition. Now, as with the Indian tradition, this is a culture that's thousands of years old. So we have a culture that's continuous over thousands of years. So obviously, there are many developments and changes and additions and so on. So I'm just going to be looking at some key concepts, and in this lecture I'll be introducing you to philosophical ideas that are overarching over all of the approaches to religion and also to health and healing. About overarching philosophical concepts, I have to look at the three sages or the three teachings, and so on the left is the Buddha, in the middle is Confucius, and on the right is Lao Tzu. And so these three philosophies have been very important in China, along with folk traditions of various kinds, and they've blended and intermingled over thousands of years. So Buddhism enters into China around 0 CE, coming across the Silk Road, and has a tremendous effect on Chinese culture. But nonetheless, that original form that's already there remains and makes it completely distinctive. So the story goes that this portrait is often referring to the called the vinegar tasters, and so the idea that when these sages tasted the vinegar, the Buddha said life is bitter, Confucius said life is sour, and Lao Tzu said life is sweet. So very different views of the world, and it's been my experience that in many Chinese families it's a mixture. I don't know why, but typically in my experience, there's a grandmother who's Buddhist. And I know historically Buddhism in China appealed to women, so I guess that's not surprising. So you can have a family where the male is Confucius and the female is Buddhist, or mixing the two. So the idea that the Buddha says the vinegar is bitter because life is suffering, and we looked at that philosophy already. Confucius saying the vinegar is sour, so life is challenging. You need to have rules and regulations to keep people on the straight and narrow. And Lao Tzu saying that life is sweet in its natural and original state. So I want to look at some presuppositions of Chinese thought. These ideas are at the back of almost all Chinese philosophy and are shared by all of them. So the first one being all aspects of the universe are interconnected. So that idea that there's no individual. So even on the societal level, the unit is the family. There's no idea of the individual standing alone, and that family unit is tied to the state, and the state is tied to the environment, and so on. Number two, there is a preordained pattern of behavior for everything in the universe. So the idea that we're not living in a chaos, we're living in a cosmos, and so there's a preordained pattern. And in order, when we get to looking at health and healing, key to being healthy is holding to that pattern and staying aligned with that pattern. This ideal is achieved when all things operate in harmony. If you were to ask me to boil down Chinese philosophy into one word, it would be harmony. It's at the absolute center, and it influences everything. So it influences politics in the idea that the good of the whole is more important than the good of the individual, and that all beings should act in harmony and cooperation. Also, it impacts health. So the idea that to have good health, the body has to be in harmony. And lastly, humanity has a special responsibility to maintain this harmony. So it's often been said that only human beings have the ability to step out of this harmony. Animals act from, or plants act from instinctual patterns. But human beings, because of our consciousness, we can move out of states of harmony and into disharmony. So from a Chinese point of view, every person has to work to maintain harmony within themselves, within their family, within society. As far back as can be traced, we find in China practices of divination, and actually in all cultures we find practices of divination. And so if we think of in the Western world, things like tarot cards, or around the world, tea leaf reading, palm reading. All of these are forms of divination, and this has been very important in China from as far back as we can trace its culture and into the present. Now, some of you may be aware that China is now officially a communist atheist state, but nonetheless these practices remain, and the Chinese government has been more and more tolerating the religions like Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism being practiced publicly. So these have maintained themselves for thousands of years. And here we have one of the original forms of divination, which is using bones, and sometimes tortoise shells were used. So they were heated and then the cracks were read to read into situations and to read into the future. Figure who would be responsible for doing these practices of divination, and particularly when it was for the emperor, it would be to divine the will of heaven. So the idea that divination can connect you to the divine and to the will of heaven, so you know how to act. And this figure would be the Wu, which is the equivalent of a Chinese shaman. And so often they will dance, they wear a particular regalia, and they enact, for instance, going into the underworld. So very clearly shamanistic aspects. They're dream interpreters, they're storytellers, they're counselors. And it's interesting to see in Asia that in the case of Korea and Japan, the shamanic role is often played by women. But in the case of China, in my understanding anyway, it's often men. So it varies from region to region. But the shamanic role is very similar to what we talked about in that section of the course. Another very important practice and belief that's maintained itself over thousands of years in East Asian civilization is the belief in ancestors. And I often struggle when I'm teaching this in a Canadian setting, and I get a lot of blank looks. But I think it's important to note that actually the majority of the world's religions have a similar belief. We find it in indigenous culture, we find it in Hindu culture, if you look at Pitra Paksha that I talked about, where you do rituals for the ancestors, and it's in Chinese culture also. It's also in African cultures. So this is a very common belief. And so in China, there's a whole religious repertoire around doing rituals for the ancestors. And so this image is of a temple. I'm going to show you a home altar. But typically the idea is that our ancestors can influence us. So there's a sense that if bad fortune is happening within a family, you might go to the Wu, to the shaman, and ask them to read into, through divination or through your dreams, why you're encountering ill health or infertility or problems with finances. And the belief is that if the ancestors are angry or you're not propitiating them properly, they can bring bad fortune onto the family. Here's an image of a home shrine, with the ancestral tablets where you would have the name of the ancestors. I read recently that for the first time, people are starting to put their female ancestors. Traditionally, it would be the male through the male line, but more and more we're seeing also the name of female ancestors being put on these tablets. And you can see against the wall there the pictures of the people. So they're being remembered, they're being prayed for using these home altars. And so this is the idea in essence that you're never away from your family. Even when you've passed away, you're still connected with your family. This is an image of the I Ching, and Jing means holy book or sacred book. And so this is considered to be one of the scriptures of Chinese religion. And so some of you may be familiar with this book. I believe there's a copy in the Nipissing Library. This practice became very popular in the 1960s. The counterculture took it up as a form of divination. And so the I Ching is, it's a book you use for divination. And so you can use coins, or you can use, if it's in a temple, yarrows, long sort of rods. But the idea is that it falls into a certain pattern and you create a hexagram out of it, and then you look in the book and read what that pattern means. So the idea that these patterns are meaningful, they're synchronicities. To give some examples, because I know that sounds very strange to say it like that. So here are some examples around a yin yang. So the different hexagrams that can be created using the I Ching. And at the center is the yin yang, which is another very important symbol within the Chinese tradition that, again, is probably familiar to you. But I just wanted to point out that people often leap to the conclusion that it means good and evil. It doesn't mean good and evil at all. Yin and yang are the two energies in the universe, and so yin is associated with the dark part of the circle. Yang is associated with the white part of the circle. I'll be talking about this more when I talk about traditional Chinese medicine, but yin is associated with the female, yang with the male. So these are understood as the two primordial energies that create everything else. So they're not good or evil, they're complementary. And if you notice, in the black is some white, in the white is some black. So the idea that even if something is female, it has male elements and vice versa. Of the Chinese tradition, we hear about this first primordial force. It's the ground of all being from which all things come. So it's called the Tao or the Way. Before the feelings of pleasure, anger, sorrow, and joy are established, there is equilibrium, the mean or the center. The establishment of these feelings in proper measure of each and proper rhythm for all is called harmony. This equilibrium is the great source of the world. This harmony is the world's universal way, or Tao. With the full attainment of equilibrium and harmony comes the proper ordering of heaven and earth and the nourishment of all things. So there you see in a nutshell the idea of the importance of equilibrium and harmony, the mean and the center. This is so foundational to Chinese thought, that everything in the universe needs to be in harmony and in equilibrium. Of Confucius or Confucius, the Latinate version of the name, and so or Master Kong, he's considered to be a sage, probably the most influential in China, and still influences Chinese culture to this day. So Confucius was a kind of lower ranking aristocrat at a time when China was in a state of civil war. And so he went about the country trying to counsel the rulers of the different states to bring about harmony. So again, you see that as a sage, he's trying to enact this harmony both in oneself and in the state. And so Confucius has been called left-wing and right-wing. He doesn't really fit very well with in any of those categories. He often spoke about proper relationship. Relationship is very important in Confucianism, and this is hierarchical relationship, but the whole tradition only understands the world in relationship. Confucianism also emphasizes filial piety, so the idea of what sons and daughters owe to their parents. And this is a central value of Chinese and I would say East Asian culture in general, the fact that it's not a choice, it's that you have obligations to your family. This is taken from the Analects of Confucius, and so it's scripture. It says, the ancient kings who wished their virtue to shine forth first ordered well their own states. Wishing to order well their states, they first regulated their families. Wishing to regulate their families, they first cultivated their persons. Wishing to cultivate their persons, they rectified themselves. So I think you can see the logic of how this is being laid out, that for the state to function properly, it has to be regulated, and that's the role of the ruler. But also, in order for the state to run smoothly, the family unit has to be regulated. And so that also has to be harmonious. And for that to be harmonious, the individual has to cultivate themselves. And I think this is a real genius of the Confucian tradition, the concept that every human being needs to develop themselves throughout their lives. And so, for instance, the ideogram for sage is a big ear and a small mouth. And so the idea that that a great sage is listening, they're not doing all the talking. And so you're learning all the time well into old age. So what does it mean then to cultivate the self? Be loyal and true to your every word, serious and careful in all that you do. Accord with the righteous, do not seek profit. Illuminate the way, do not calculate the advantages. Do not do to others what you do not want done to you. Whenever you fail to achieve your purpose, look into yourself. So this is very much a kind of introspective way of refining the self. And so, and also acting ethically in the world. So it's both an interior and an exterior practice. And again, we see this humility and the idea that you don't seek profit. And within Confucianism, at the top of society is the scholar. It's not a business person, for instance. So the idea is to seek knowledge. Knowledge is very much prized within Confucian philosophy, and to seek harmony with other people, and to only do unto others what you would want done to you, which is the golden rule, of course. Di, or the Yellow Emperor, is one of the ancient mythological emperors of China, sometimes considered to be a patron saint of Taoism, which we're going to be looking at in a moment. And he's credited with bringing about all sorts of cultural advancements, including in government. And some traditions credit him with being the first to coin money, for instance, to unite the Chinese kingdom, and his wife was reputed to have discovered the production of silk. So hard to know if this was ever a real person, but he's considered to be one of the ideal emperors, and he's seen as being a paragon of wisdom whose reign was a golden age. So I'm going to talk more about him because he's associated with health and healing as well through the text, the text of the Yellow Emperor. So I'm going to get to that in a different lecture. But according to myth, he ruled over a harmonious kingdom. He kept in alignment with the will of heaven. He was a virtuous ruler, and upon his death, he is said to have become an immortal. I want to now look at the tradition of Taoism. So it's one of the three teachings. So we had Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and then that Chinese tradition, folk tradition that combines it all. And just to be clear, a person can practice all of these. It's not like Abrahamic traditions where you're only one. You can practice, you can combine. And there's a saying that you're a Taoist at home and a Confucian at work, or you're a Confucian when you're working and you're a Taoist when you retire. So this idea that they represent different aspects, but certainly Taoism and Confucianism both value harmony. This is an image of Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu, who is usually placed around the 6th century CE, so at the same time as the Buddha. And he has, again, like the Yellow Emperor, a semi-legendary status. It's hard to know if this was an actual person, but it doesn't actually matter. The history tells us a lot. The stories about him tells us a lot. So according to the myth, he was an archivist or historian, and he became so annoyed by all the people coming to ask his advice that he headed west and to leave the Chinese state to be a hermit. And so this image of him riding on a buffalo is very common. And the story goes that when he got to the gate, the end point of the Chinese kingdom, the end of the world from that point of view, the gatekeeper asked him to write down his wisdom so that it could be passed on to other people before he left. And so according to the tradition, this was the Tao Te Ching. So the other the sacred scriptures of Taoism. Taoism has a very different tone than Confucianism, and in many ways they are opposite, or at least they complement one another. And there's a real riddling quality, kind of poetic quality to Taoism. And this was annoying to Confucians, so it isn't just later people that are reading it. It was annoying to Confucians as well. If you're trying to follow it logically, it's not going to work. So this is the opposite of logic. It's a much more intuitive tradition. When I teach this in one of my other courses, I always ask the students, once they get some sense of the traditions, whether they think they're a Taoist or Confucian. And it really varies from year to year. Sometimes I have all Confucians, sometimes I have a lot of Taoists, so it's interesting to see, but definitely people usually know right away who they are. So the Taoists generally made fun of the Confucians for being real rule followers, very rigid, and the Confucians just think, essentially the Taoists are a bunch of hippies. So this is the first very opening lines of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The origin of heaven and earth is nameless, but it may be referred to as the mother of all things. So you can see that riddling paradoxical quality here. So that idea that we're struggling with writing down something that goes beyond words. And so all religious traditions partake of this to some degree, the idea that the important things are so far beyond words. And so it's very typical for religions actually to use poetry to try to get at some of these more intuitive insights. This quotation from the Tao Te Ching, I think, really captures a lot of the feel of it. So the way of heaven is not to contend and yet to be able to conquer, not to declare its will and yet to get a response, not to summon but to have things come spontaneously. The Tao produces all things. It produces them without holding possession of them. The Tao is ever inactive, and yet there is nothing it does not do. So this seems contradictory, obviously, if we're using just logic. But if you sit with it, it's like poetry. I think it starts to make a kind of sense. So the way of heaven. So again, within Chinese thought, that idea of always trying to ascertain, either through divination or other means, the will of heaven. And so nothing's going to go right until you're in alignment with that. So according to Taoism, the way to be in alignment with the will of heaven is not to contend, not to get into conflict. And so I often give the example of what sometimes gets called soft power. That idea that, and this is something I think as you live longer, you realize that I think at least some people, when you're younger, you think, oh, I'm going to take every conflict. I'm going to fight it. I'm going to die on every hill. And this is very much the idea that that actually just often causes more obstacles and problems. And just to give a really obvious example, when you fight with somebody, often they get angry at you and they're not willing to cooperate with you. So this is the idea. Again, we can see the importance of harmony here. Not to summon, but to have things come spontaneously. To be ever inactive, and yet there's nothing it does not do. So this is very much the idea that when we move through life intuitively, we don't always have to be making things happen or planning. That when the person's in alignment with the will of heaven, these things will just start to happen naturally. Now, people who have a Confucian turn of mind find this extremely irritating. And I've had students get quite irritated with this. And these are the people that like to make lists and plan. Like I've met students who have a 5-year plan, and I'm like, good luck with that one. But that idea that we can control everything that's happening, this is the opposite. This is much more obviously a spiritual view of the world, that we're not in control of all of this, and that in fact, sometimes the best metaphor, I'm sorry, I can think of is of a surfer, that you're going with the water, you're not going against the water. And the metaphor of water in Taoism is central, that idea that water, it conquers everything, but it doesn't contend. It just goes around obstacles. Again, this is from the Tao Te Ching. What is softest in the world overcomes the hardest in the world. So the image that's often used is of a boulder in a river. The water just goes around it. Nothing penetrates where there is no space. Thus I know that in doing nothing there is advantage. The wordless teaching and the advantage of doing nothing. There are few in the world who understand it. So the ideal from a Taoist, like of a Taoist sage, is somebody who's completely withdrawn from the world, is not seeking fame or fortune, who's just quietly living in alignment with nature, living in alignment with the will of heaven. And so I don't think it would be very surprising to see that a lot of Taoists were artists and creative people. And even when we look at the hippie counterculture who took up Taoism and Taoist texts, it was often people who were in creative arts. You can see that this, if in certain occupations, this philosophy would not work. So certainly in terms of the ruling philosophy of China, it tended to be Confucian. The bureaucracy was built on Confucian concepts, but Taoism is kind of the complementary aspect of Chinese philosophy, and it emphasizes things like spontaneity, simplicity, naturalness. So the ideal from a Taoist point of view is a small village community that doesn't need a lot of rules and regulation and just lives in harmony with nature. Another key concept in Taoism is Wu Wei, or non-action. So the Tao Te Ching says, without going out the door, one can know the whole world. Without peeping out the window, one can see the Tao of heaven. The further one travels, the less one knows. There the sage knows everything without traveling, names everything without seeing it. So again, that idea of the sage who just stays quietly within, they're not feeling this need for constant stimulation and travel, for instance, but are going inside. It's about the interior world. And so Taoism very much mixes together with Buddhism in East Asia and creates various forms of contemplative practice that emerge as a kind of mixing of those two traditions. Very early on in the Taoist tradition, we see an interest in what might be called medicine, but really the preoccupation was with immortality, so allowing your lifespan to extend as far as possible. And so this is an image of the 8 immortals, so the idea that they practiced so much self-refinement that they became immortal. And so this search for the elixir of immortality becomes a great preoccupation in Taoism, and it leads to all sorts of findings in pharmacology and medicine and so on. And so I'll be talking about this in more detail in the next lectures.